The Resonance Matrix, Volume 2, Episode 6, Seduction. The narcotic softening of will. There is a moment after tension releases where the body exhales before the mind catches up, a subtle softening, a warmth that spreads rather than spikes, the sense that you no longer need to be alert. This is where seduction begins. Welcome back to the Resonance Matrix, Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode. If you've been following this series from the beginning, you'll recognize the terrain we're moving through, not as a ladder of ideas, but as a descent through states, a gradual shift in how influence moves through the body before it ever reaches thought. In Volume 1, we explored the architecture of the field, the environments that condition perception, shape identity, and establish the background frequencies we mistake for normality. In Volume 2, we moved closer, inside language, inside tone, inside timing. We began with propaganda, where collective atmospheres are engineered until individual thought dissolves into coherence. We moved through dogmatism, where nuance collapses and internal flexibility hardens into certainty. We examined instigation, where agitation is introduced to create a restless moment. Then provocation, where tension is deliberately struck to harvest a reaction. Each episode traced a single movement, from environment to body to meaning to behavior. Now we arrive at something different, because seduction does not strike. It soothes. The shift in the field: if provocation felt sharp, seduction feels smooth. If provocation created charge and heat, seduction offers warmth. If provocation demanded response, seduction invites rest. This is not an escalation. It is a transition. Transitions are where vigilance drops. Seduction is not the opposite of provocation. It is its completion. After the nervous system has been activated, mobilized, and harvested, it longs for relief, not intellectually, but biologically. The body does not want to remain tense. It seeks resolution, softness, coherence. Seduction answers that need, not by restoring truth, but by restoring comfort. This is why seduction is so effective and so difficult to name, because nothing feels wrong. Why seduction is harder to see: most people associate influence with pressure, arguments, persuasion, conflict, control. Seduction bypasses all of that. It does not argue with you. It does not contradict you. It does not need to convince. Instead, it aligns. It says, "You're safe now. You don't need to think so hard. This feels right." And in many cases it does. That is the problem. Seduction does not remove agency through force. It displaces it through comfort. The nervous system relaxes. The guard lowers. Critical reflection fades, not because it is suppressed, but because it no longer feels necessary. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. From the inside, something subtle shifts. The internal reference point moves outward. Recalling the descent so far to understand seduction, we need to situate it precisely within the arc we've been tracing. Each phase in this series corresponds to a state change, not a belief change. Propaganda establishes the field, the background signal. Dogmatism hardens internal ground, eliminating flexibility. Instigation injects restlessness, creating movement. Provocation spikes tension, harvesting reaction. Seduction arrives after all of this. It does not create the conditions of influence. It capitalizes on them. By the time seduction appears, the nervous system is already primed, alert, fatigued, and seeking resolution. Seduction offers that resolution, but at a cost, not immediately visible, not consciously negotiated, but embodied. The core question of this episode is not asking, how do people manipulate? It is asking, what happens in the body when comfort replaces vigilance? And further, what decisions get made in that softened state before cognition returns? Because this is where many of the most consequential choices occur: purchases, commitments, loyalties, identities, and beliefs. Not when we are pressured, but when we are relieved. Seduction as state engineering. One of the central premises of the mirror linguistic hypothesis is that language does not merely communicate information. It regulates the state. Tone, pacing, metaphor, and implication do not persuade the mind first. They entrain the nervous system. Seduction operates entirely at this level. It does not need logic. It does not need proof. It does not even need coherence. It needs resonance. When language, imagery, and atmosphere align just enough to mirror a desired state into the body, action follows naturally, often before reflection. This is why people say, "I don't know why I did it. It just felt right at the time." They are not lying. Cognition arrived late. Comfort is not neutral. One of the myths this episode will gently dismantle is the idea that comfort is inherently benign. Comfort is not bad, but it is not neutral. Comfort lowers defenses. Comfort reduces scrutiny. Comfort shortens the ineffable gap, the space between sensation and choice. In safe environments, this is not a problem. But in engineered fields, digital, commercial, ideological, and comfort become a vector of influence. It is how products are sold, lifestyles are idealized, identities are offered, and belonging is simulated. Seduction does not ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Can you relax here?" The body first, the mind later. Throughout this series, we've returned again and again to a simple but unsettling sequence: body to action and action to meaning, not meaning to choice and choice to action. Seduction exploits this order. The body softens, action becomes easier, meaning is constructed after the fact. This is why buyer's remorse exists, post-commitment doubt arises, and people take decisions they no longer feel aligned with. It's not stupidity, it's timing. Cognition did not fail, it was simply late. Why this episode matters: seduction is everywhere. in advertising, in branding, in influencer culture, in parasocial relationships, in wellness narratives, in empowerment language, and in status economies. Perhaps most importantly, in the stories we tell ourselves when tension finally releases. This episode is not here to make you suspicious of pleasure or warmth. It is here to restore the sequence, to help you recognize when comfort is arriving before consent, when softness is offered instead of truth, when relief becomes a substitute for alignment. How to listen to this episode. This episode does not reward speed. If you listen quickly, you may miss the point. Seduction works slowly, gently, almost kindly. So let this episode unfold at the pace your body prefers. Notice when you relax, when you agree internally, when resistance fades. Nothing needs to be done with these moments. Just notice the timing, because timing is where sovereignty lives. A quiet orientation before we begin. Seduction is not evil. It is not always intentional. It is not always external. Sometimes seduction is the nervous system's attempt to protect itself from exhaustion. The danger arises not from comfort itself, but from forgetting to return, forgetting to bring cognition back online after the body has softened. This episode is about remembering that return, not through effort, but through awareness. In the next section, we'll begin gently mapping what seduction actually is, linguistically and biologically, starting with its roots, its true definition, and how it differs from desire, attraction, or intimacy. For now, just settle into the warmth. Notice what part of you wants to stay there. The cognitive hook relief as permission when thinking quietly steps aside seduction does not begin with desire. It begins with permission, not the kind of permission that is asked for or negotiated, but the kind that is quietly granted when effort drops and vigilance dissolves. The permission to stop checking. The permission to stop thinking. The permission to rest inside a feeling that promises coherence. This is the cognitive hook of seduction. It does not seize the mind, it relieves it. Relief, once it arrives, carries its own authority. The exhaustion that precedes seduction rarely appears in a neutral nervous system. It follows effort to stay alert, effort to interpret, effort to respond correctly, effort to manage ambiguity. By the time seduction enters, the system is already tired. This is not accidental. Across the arc we've been tracing, from propaganda through dogmatism, instigation, and provocation, the nervous system has been repeatedly mobilized, not always dramatically, often subtly, but persistently. Attention has been demanded, position has been required, reaction has been harvested. Even when the body is no longer in overt fight or flight, it carries the residue of readiness. Seduction arrives as the opposite of demand. It says, "You don't need to do anything now." That sentence lands deeply. Relief as a cognitive event. We tend to think of relief as emotional, but relief is cognitive. Relief reduces load. When relief appears, the brain interprets it as resolution, even if nothing has actually been resolved. The mere reduction of tension signals completion. This is a critical point. The nervous system is not primarily concerned with truth. It is concerned with closure. Seduction exploits this. By offering a felt sense of closure, warmth, reassurance, and belonging, it allows the brain to disengage from active evaluation. This disengagement is not laziness. It is efficiency. The brain conserves energy when it believes a situation is stable. Seduction creates the impression of stability. I can stop thinking now. One of the most reliable internal markers of seduction is a subtle thought that appears without announcement. I can stop thinking now. This thought is rarely explicit. It may appear as a sense of ease, a softening of concern, a trustful leaning in, and a quiet internal yes. What matters is not the content, but the function. This moment marks the handover of authority. Before seduction, cognition is active, evaluating, comparing, scanning, and questioning. After seduction, cognition recedes, not because it was defeated, but because it feels unnecessary. This is the cognitive hook. Seduction does not silence the mind. It convinces the mind that silence is safe. Moral licensing. I've earned this. Another mechanism through which seduction gains traction is moral licensing. After effort, restraint, or vigilance, the nervous system is primed to allow itself something. Comfort feels deserved. This is not indulgence. It is regulation. The body seeks balance. Seduction frames itself as that balance. You've worked hard. You've been through a lot. You deserve ease. Even when these messages are not spoken aloud, they are often implied atmospherically. Once moral licensing is activated, scrutiny drops further. The mind no longer asks, "Is this aligned?" It asks, "Why not?" This shift is small but decisive. Narrative completion. This explains everything. The third major cognitive hook is narrative completion. Seduction often arrives with a story, not a complex one, but a satisfying one. A story that explains past discomfort, justifies present relief, and promises future coherence. These stories are rarely logical in a strict sense. They are emotionally complete. Examples include, "This is what I was missing. Now it all makes sense. This feels like home. This is who I really am." Narrative completion is powerful because the brain is a meaning-making organ. It seeks patterns, arcs, and resolution. When a story arrives that resolves tension, especially tension that has been prolonged, the brain relaxes its grip. Critical faculties step back, not because they were overridden, but because the story works at the level of felt coherence. From an MLH perspective, this is where language mirrors a stable internal state into the nervous system, not by argument, but by resonance. Choice becomes optional. This is the most important insight of this section. Seduction does not remove choice. It makes choice feel unnecessary. When choice feels unnecessary, agency quietly dissolves, not through coercion, not through deception, but through comfort. At this point, decisions may still be made, purchases, commitments, alignments, and declarations, but they are made post-relief, not post-reflection. The body has already moved. The mind follows. Why this feels so personal, one of the reasons seduction is difficult to discuss, is that it feels intimate. It feels like your desire, your preference, your intuition, and in a sense, it is. Seduction does not implant foreign content. It amplifies existing longings, to belong, to be seen, to rest, to be valued, and to feel coherent. This is why seduction rarely feels manipulative in the moment. It feels affirming, which makes later dissonance especially painful. When cognition returns, often after action, the individual may experience confusion, shame, or self-blame. Why did I do that? I knew better. I wasn't thinking. But this framing is inaccurate. You were thinking, just not at the moment. Thinking was required. The delay of cognition seduction relies on temporal displacement. Cognition is not eliminated. It is delayed. This delay explains buyer's remorse, post-commitment doubt, relational disillusionment, and ideological regret. In each case, the sequence is similar. 1 state shifts 2, action occurs 3, dopamine resolves 4. Cognition returns. The problem is not a lack of intelligence. It is misaligned timing. By the time the mind re-engages, the action has already been taken, the identity invested, the narrative public. At that point, cognition is often recruited defensively, not to reassess, but to justify. This is how seduction stabilizes itself long-term. Comfort as authority. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of seduction is that it positions comfort as truth. When something feels good, aligned, or relieving, the nervous system treats that feeling as evidence. This is not irrational. It is embodied logic. In evolutionary terms, comfort often signaled safety. But in engineered fields, advertising, branding, ideological spaces, parasocial relationships, comfort can be manufactured without safety. Seduction exploits this mismatch. It offers felt safety without structural safety. The cognitive hook is not false belief. It is misplaced trust in sensation. Why resistance often fails here. Many people attempt to resist seduction by becoming skeptical, cynical, or guarded. This rarely works. Seduction does not confront skepticism. It bypasses it. Resistance requires effort. Seduction offers rest. When the nervous system is tired, rest wins. This is why the antidote to seduction is not suspicion. It is sequence restoration, allowing cognition to return before action, not after. But the sequence cannot be forced. It must be felt. A quiet reorientation as this section closes. Nothing is being asked of you. No vigilance, no discipline, no withdrawal. Only awareness of a pattern that may already feel familiar. Notice how often relief carries authority. Notice how quickly comfort silences questions. Notice how easily warmth replaces discernment. These are not failures. They are human responses in environments designed to exploit timing. Seduction works not because you are weak, but because you are tired of holding yourself together, and that makes the invitation very hard to refuse. In the next section, we will slow further and name seduction precisely, tracing its linguistic roots and clarifying how being led aside differs from desire, intimacy, or attraction. For now, simply stay with this. Relief is not consent. Comfort is not alignment. And the moment you stop checking is often the moment influence begins. The etymology and definition. To lead aside before seduction became associated with attraction, pleasure, or intimacy. It describes something far more subtle and far more consequential, movement away from an original position. The word itself carries this instruction quietly. Seduction derives from the Latin seducere, se meaning aside or away, and ducere, to lead. To seduce, in its original sense, was not to overpower or persuade, but to guide someone off their path without force. The emphasis was never on desire. It was on redirection. This distinction is essential. Seduction is not the creation of a new want. It is the displacement of an existing orientation. To be seduced is not to be pushed forward, but to be drawn sideways, often gently enough that the movement is not immediately noticed. The original direction does not vanish. It simply fades into the background as something else takes its place. This is why seduction so often escapes detection. There is no rupture, no obvious conflict, no moment where resistance is required. There is only a gradual shift in where attention rests, where effort flows, and where meaning is sourced. Within the resonance matrix framework, seduction marks a critical transition, the moment when external signals begin to feel more regulating than internal reference. Seduction is not desire. Modern language often collapses seduction into desire. This is a mistake. Desire is internally generated. Seduction is externally structured. Desire arises from within the body and brain, from appetite, curiosity, longing, or attraction. Seduction, by contrast, operates through atmosphere, not impulse. It does not stimulate hunger. It presents a table already set and invites you to sit down. This is why seduction often feels calm rather than charged. Where provocation created tension and urgency, seduction offers resolution. It smooths, it reassures, it makes space feel coherent again. The nervous system recognizes this shift immediately, even if the mind cannot yet articulate what has changed. Seduction does not excite the body into motion. It permits the body to stop resisting. That permission carries power. To be led aside without knowing the most effective seduction is the one that is never recognized as such. If someone knows they are being seduced, the spell is already weakened. Awareness reintroduces agency. Evaluation returns. The body stiffens slightly. True seduction, therefore, avoids confrontation. It does not challenge beliefs directly. It does not argue against existing values. Instead, it reframes the environment so that old orientations feel unnecessary, even burdensome. This reframing happens through tone that reassures rather than asserts, language that affirms rather than convinces, and imagery that promises coherence rather than excitement. The result is a quiet internal shift. I don't need to hold myself this way anymore. That sentence is rarely spoken aloud. It is felt. Once it is felt, the original orientation, the skepticism, the caution, the internal checking, begins to loosen on its own. Seduction as displacement of agency. At the heart of seduction is not manipulation, but displacement. Agency does not disappear, it moves. Instead of being sourced internally through sensation, intuition, reflection, agency begins to reference something external, an image, a narrative, a relationship, a brand, a role, and a promise. This shift is rarely dramatic. It often feels like alignment. I resonate with this. This feels like me. This makes sense of things. But resonance is not authorship. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this moment marks a crucial mirroring event. The nervous system begins to entrain to an external frequency that offers regulation. Language, imagery, and tone mirror a state of safety or coherence in the body, and the body accepts it as relief. Once that acceptance occurs, the agency subtly follows. Decisions begin to align with the new reference point. Actions feel natural within the offered frame. Dissent feels unnecessary. Distance feels odd. The individual has not been overpowered. They have been reoriented. Why seduction feels voluntary. One of the reasons seduction is so difficult to name and so difficult to challenge is that it feels voluntary. There is no obvious coercion, no sense of being trapped. Often, there is even a sense of gratitude. This helped me. I needed this. I chose this. And in many ways, that is true. Seduction does not operate by removing choice. It operates by narrowing the field of perceived options until one path feels obvious and the others feel irrelevant. This narrowing happens not through exclusion, but through saturation. One option becomes so emotionally complete, so atmospherically satisfying, that alternatives no longer register as meaningful. The nervous system is not deciding between paths. It is resting. From that rest, action flows. The role of promise seduction almost always carries a promise, not necessarily an explicit one. Often the promise is implied: belonging, ease, identity, coherence, recognition, safety, and completion. These promises are not inherently deceptive. Many are deeply human needs. What makes seduction dangerous is not the promise itself, but the timing of its delivery. Seduction offers promise before integration, before reflection, before consent is fully embodied. The body receives the promise first. The mind rationalizes later. This reversal of sequence is the defining feature of seduction within the resonance matrix. Seduction and the loss of return. One of the least discussed aspects of seduction is what happens afterwards. In many cases, seduction does not end with a clear rupture. There is no moment of realization, no dramatic betrayal. Instead, there is a gradual sense of distance from one's original self. People often describe this as, I don't feel like myself anymore. I'm not sure when I stopped questioning. I don't know how I got here. This is not because seduction destroyed something. It is because seduction did not include a return path. In healthy experiences of pleasure, comfort, or intimacy, there is a natural oscillation. Engagement to rest, rest to reflection, and reflection to re-engagement. Seduction interrupts this cycle by making the resting state permanent. Reflection never fully reactivates. The nervous system remains oriented toward the external source of regulation. This is why seduction, left unexamined, can evolve into dependency, not necessarily on a person, but on a state, an image, or a narrative. For resonance matrix definition within this framework, seduction can be defined precisely. Seduction is the linguistic and symbolic process by which resistance is softened, and agency is displaced through comfort, status, or promise before reflective cognition is re-engaged. This definition matters because it removes moral judgment. Seduction is not villainy. It is a process, and processes can be understood. Seduction versus intimacy. It is important to draw a careful distinction here. Seduction is not intimacy. Intimacy requires mutual presence. Seduction requires only atmosphere. Intimacy invites reflection. Seduction suspends it. Intimacy allows return. Seduction discourages it. This does not mean seduction is always malicious. It means seduction is one-directional. It leads aside. The body's role in being led aside. One of the reasons seduction is so effective is that the body welcomes it. After tension, the body longs for ease. After vigilance, it seeks softness. Seduction provides both. But the body does not evaluate alignment. It evaluates regulation. If something regulates the nervous system, lowers threat, softens vigilance, and restores warmth, the body accepts it as beneficial. This acceptance is precognitive. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, language that seduces does not inform the brain. It updates the nervous system's predictive model. The body learns, this environment is safe enough to relax. Once that learning occurs, the system reorganizes itself accordingly. Muscles soften, breath slows, posture opens, and with that opening, discernment narrows, not because the individual has become foolish, but because the organism believes it has arrived somewhere safe. Seduction as a phase, not a trait. Another critical clarification. Seduction is not a personality type. People are not seducers in essence. Seduction is a phase of influence, a tactic within a broader arc. Entire systems can seduce, cultures can seduce, markets can seduce, narratives can seduce. Often, no single agent is consciously directing the process. This is why seduction persists even when no one appears to be at fault. The field itself carries the seduction. Why naming seduction matters. Many people sense seduction only after its effects have settled in. They notice regret, loss of clarity, diminished self-trust, and confusion about prior values. Without language for seduction, these experiences are often misinterpreted as personal failure. I should have known better. I was naive. I let myself down. Naming seduction reframes this. It allows the individual to see that something systemic and patterned occurred, not a lapse in intelligence, but a sequence that unfolded before reflection could reassert itself. This recognition restores dignity, and dignity is the first step back toward agency. A quiet pause before we continue. As this section closes, there is no conclusion to reach, only an orientation to hold. Seduction is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives with ease. And the question this episode will continue to explore is not, how do I avoid seduction? But how do I recognize when ease arrives before alignment? That recognition does not require suspicion. It requires timing. In the next section, we will move into the somatic dimension of seduction, mapping how the vagal system softens, how vigilance drops, and how language regulates rather than excites. For now, let this linger. You are not weak for wanting comfort, but comfort is not a compass. The somatic blueprint, the softening of the vagal shield. Seduction is not first recognized as a thought. It is recognized as a release, a lowering of the shoulders, a softening behind the eyes, a breath that finally completes itself. Where provocation tightened the system and pulled attention forward, seduction allows the body to settle back into itself, and because that settling feels like relief, it is welcomed. This is the somatic blueprint of seduction. Not excitation, not intensity, but downregulation. The vagal shield. To understand seduction somatically, we need to understand what relaxes. The vagus nerve is often described as the nerve of safety, but this description is incomplete. The vagal system does not simply signal calm, it mediates social engagement, trust, and coherence. It allows the organism to remain open to connection without remaining hypervigilant. The vagal shield is not a physical barrier. It is a state-dependent boundary, the body's and brain's capacity to remain receptive while still maintaining internal reference. When the vagal system is well regulated, openness and discernment coexist. One can relax without dissolving. One can receive without surrendering. Seduction works by softening this shield prematurely, not breaking it, not bypassing it, but persuading it to stand down. From vigilance to warmth. After prolonged periods of tension, vigilance, or sympathetic mobilization, the nervous system longs for relief. The body does not crave truth. It craves restoration of balance. Seduction offers that restoration. This transition often begins subtly, a warmth spreading through the chest, breath lengthening without effort, muscles losing their edge, posture opening and facial tension easing. Nothing about this feels dangerous. In fact, it feels right. The nervous system interprets these sensations as signals of safety. Threat detection quiets. Orientation shifts from scanning to receiving. This is not dysfunction. It is biology. Regulation without resolution. The key to seduction's effectiveness lies in one fact. The body can be regulated without being aligned. Seduction provides regulation first. The nervous system settles. Stress hormones drop. Heart rate variability increases. Muscular guarding reduces. From the body's perspective, something has improved, but nothing has necessarily been resolved at the level of meaning, values, or agency. This mismatch is crucial. Regulation normally follows resolution. Seduction reverses the order. When regulation arrives first, the nervous system assumes resolution has occurred, even when it hasn't. This assumption has consequences. The collapse of critical awareness. As the body enters a ventral vagal state, several cognitive shifts occur naturally. Attention broadens but loses sharpness. Threat appraisal decreases. Contradictions feel less urgent. This is not stupidity. It is neuroeconomy. The brain reallocates resources when danger appears to have passed. Analytical vigilance becomes metabolically unnecessary. This is why seduction does not need to suppress critical thinking. Critical thinking simply stands down. The mind does not go offline. It goes quiet, and in that quiet, influence deepens. Warmth as a signal. One of the most misunderstood sensations in seduction is warmth. Warmth is often interpreted as goodness, alignment, or truth, but biologically, warmth is a signal of vasodilation, the expansion of blood vessels as the threat recedes. Warmth means you can lower your guard. Seduction uses warmth as a linguistic and symbolic signal, reassuring tone, inclusive language, aesthetic softness, and moral affirmation. These cues are processed somatically before they are interpreted cognitively. From an MLH perspective, this is where language acts as biological software, not by delivering content, but by altering state. Words do not need to be persuasive. They only need to feel safe enough. The slowing of breath is one of the clearest markers of seduction. During provocation, breath becomes shallow or suspended. During seduction, it lengthens. This lengthening is involuntary. The diaphragm releases. Exhalation deepens. The body shifts from readiness to receptivity. This shift is often experienced as relief, but breath does not discriminate between safe environments and safe-feeling environments. Seduction exploits this by creating atmospheres that encourage slower breathing through music, pacing, imagery, and voice. The field entrains the body into openness. Once breath slows, the nervous system follows. Softening without consent. One of the most unsettling aspects of seduction is that the body softens without being asked. There is no moment of explicit consent. The organism responds automatically to cues of safety. This is why seduction often feels like something that just happened. You did not decide to relax. You did not choose to trust. Your body responded. Later, cognition may arrive and attempt to justify what has already occurred. It felt right. I was comfortable. I didn't see a problem. These statements are true, but incomplete. They describe state, not alignment. The narrowing of the ineffable gap. Earlier in this series, we discussed the ineffable gap, the space between sensation and action where sovereignty resides. Seduction narrows this gap not by speeding it up, but by making action unnecessary. When the body is comfortable, urgency disappears. When urgency disappears, the sense of needing to decide fades. Action becomes passive, agreeing rather than choosing, continuing rather than committing, and drifting rather than directing. This passivity feels peaceful, but peace without awareness can become quiet surrender. The pleasure of not checking seduction offers something deeply attractive, relief from self-monitoring. Checking takes effort. Checking tone, checking intention, checking alignment, and checking consequences. Seduction says, you don't need to check anymore. The nervous system receives this as kindness. But checking is not pathology, it is a self-reference. When checking stops entirely, the reference moves outward. The role of identity softening seduction often coincides with identity relaxation. Roles soften, boundaries blur, distinctions fade. This is often described as being yourself, but it can also be being unguarded in an environment that has not yet earned that openness. Identity softening is not a loss of self. It is temporary permeability. Seduction extends that permeability without ensuring reciprocity. The body accepts before the mind knows. Perhaps the most important feature of seduction's somatic blueprint is this. The body accepts before the mind understands. This is not a flaw. It is how mammals survive social environments. But in modern fields, saturated with symbolic cues, parasocial intimacy, and engineered warmth, this sequence is exploited. The body says yes. The mind explains later. An explanation is not the same as consent. When softness becomes vulnerability, softness is not weakness. But softness without internal reference becomes exposure. This is where seduction can slide into dependency, manipulation, or gaslighting, not because the individual is foolish, but because the nervous system has been guided into openness without support. Once the vagal shield is lowered, contradictory signals can pass through more easily. Doubt can be introduced gently. Influence can deepen quietly. This is why seduction precedes gaslighting in the resonance matrix. You cannot erode someone's internal reference while they are tense. You must first make them comfortable. The sedated body in prolonged seduction. The body may remain in a low arousal ventral state that feels calm but dull. People describe this as numb but okay, peaceful but disconnected, comfortable but empty. This is not true regulation. It is sedation. The nervous system is not oscillating naturally. It is being held in a narrow band of comfort. Critical energy does not spike. Curiosity dulls. Discomfort is avoided. This state is extremely functional for systems that rely on compliance. The difficulty of leaving comfort, leaving seduction, is harder than leaving provocation. Provocation hurts. Seduction soothes. Walking away from comfort feels irrational. It feels ungrateful. It can even feel cruel. This is why people remain in misaligned relationships, exploitative work cultures, parasocial dynamics, and identity systems that no longer fit, not because they are trapped, but because leaving would require re-entering discomfort. The body resists this. Relearning oscillation. Healthy nervous systems oscillate, tension and release, engagement and withdrawal, closeness and distance. Seduction arrests this movement. It holds the system in release without return. Recovery from seduction does not require rejection of comfort. It requires restoration of oscillation. Comfort must be followed by reflection. Warmth must be followed by checking. Ease must be followed by return to self. A gentle reorientation. As this section closes, there is nothing to undo, only something to notice. The next time comfort arrives, suddenly notice what softened, what quieted, and what stopped asking questions. This noticing is not resistance. It is present. Presence is what allows comfort to be received without surrender. In the next section, we will ground this blueprint in real-world fields, advertising, marketing, influencer economies, and symbolic lifestyles, showing how seduction is engineered culturally, not just interpersonally. For now, let this settle. Softness is not safety. Comfort is not concern, and ease is not alignment. Field case study. Seductive advertising and symbolic lifestyle. Seduction becomes most difficult to recognize when it is no longer interpersonal, when there is no single voice to confront, no obvious agent to blame, no moment of persuasion to point to. Instead, there is an environment. A field, a carefully curated atmosphere in which nothing feels demanded, yet everything gently pulls. This is where seduction moves from tactic to infrastructure, from interaction to environment. In earlier sections, Seduction was described as a process that leads the individual aside, away from their original position, away from internal reference, away from checking. In modern culture, this process rarely unfolds through direct interaction alone. It unfolds through fields of exposure, advertising, branding, social platforms, influencer economies, aestheticized lifestyles, wellness narratives, and status symbolism. These are not neutral backdrops. They are state-shaping environments. They do not ask you to believe something. They ask you to inhabit something, and inhabiting a state is far more powerful than agreeing with an idea. Advertising as state engineering, advertising no longer sells products. It sells regulated nervous systems. This shift did not happen accidentally. Early advertising focused on utility, what a product did, why it worked. How does it compare? Modern advertising focuses on how you will feel once you are inside the frame it offers. Belonging, ease, confidence, desirability, status, and coherence. The product itself becomes secondary. It is not the object that is purchased. It is the state. The object is merely the access token. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is crucial. The language, imagery, pacing, and repetition of advertising mirror a desired autonomic state into the body before cognition evaluates cost, necessity, or alignment. By the time the mind engages, the body has already accepted the premise. This is why people often say, "I don't know why I bought it, it just felt right." They are describing somatic entrainment, not irrationality. The seductive economy of platforms, digital platforms, are not passive hosts for content. They are regulatory environments. Every design choice, infinite scroll, autoplay, algorithmic timing, and notification cadence is oriented toward keeping the nervous system in a state that is neither tense nor fully at rest. Just open enough, just engaged enough, just comfortable enough. Seduction here does not arrive as persuasion. It arrives with ease of continuation. You don't decide to stay. You simply don't leave. The nervous system settles into a low-effort engagement state where reflection feels unnecessary and exit feels disruptive. This is seduction without words. Influencer culture and para-relational warmth influencer economies represent one of the clearest examples of seduction as a field phenomenon. These are not primarily marketing channels. They are simulated relational spaces. The influencer does not sell directly. They share, they confide, they relate. The tone is intimate, but the relationship is asymmetrical. The nervous system responds to cues of familiarity, warmth, and recognition. Facial expressions, voice modulation, eye contact, and pacing all signal social safety. From the body's perspective, this feels like a connection, but there is no reciprocity. This creates what can be described as para-relational seduction. Intimacy without obligation, validation without risk, and belonging without negotiation. The nervous system responds to the warmth. Agency drifts. Purchasing becomes secondary. The primary effect is orientation, whose voice regulates you when you are tired, uncertain, or seeking ease. OnlyFans and the seduction of attention OnlyFans is often framed reductively as sexual content or transactional intimacy, but structurally, it represents something deeper. It is not eroticism that seduces most effectively here. It is availability, the sense that someone is present for you, that attention is stable, that warmth can be accessed on demand. This is not intimacy. It is regulated closeness. The nervous system responds to the promise of attunement, even when the mind knows it is mediated, monetized, or performative. Seduction here works by resolving loneliness at the level of sensation, not relationship. The result is not always exploitation, but it is often displacement. Attention that could have returned inward is routed outward. Agency does not vanish, it relocates. Symbolic lifestyles and the identity shortcut. One of the most powerful forms of seduction in modern culture is the symbolic lifestyle. Cars do not promise transport, they promise status. Fitness bodies do not promise health, they promise control, desirability, and worth. Wellness retreats do not promise rest, they promise transformation. These symbols operate as identity shortcuts. Rather than building coherence slowly through lived experience, symbolic lifestyles offer a compressed version. Be seen as this. The nervous system responds not to the object, but to the promise of coherence, and coherence feels like relief. This is why symbolic lifestyles are seductive. They allow the individual to step into a ready-made identity without the friction of uncertainty. Reflection becomes unnecessary. Checking feels redundant. The historical lineage of seductive mass influence, this process did not begin with social media. Its architecture was formalized in the early 20th century, when psychological insight was first deliberately integrated into mass communication. The shift was simple but profound. From informing the public to shaping desire, rational appeals were replaced with emotional alignment. Products were linked to identity, status, and belonging. Language became atmospheric rather than propositional. What changed was not ethics, but method. Influence stopped addressing the mind directly and began addressing the body. Mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHFT, offers a biological explanation for why this worked so well. Repeated linguistic and symbolic exposure updates the nervous system's predictive models. The body learns what normal feels like. Once normality shifts, consent follows quietly. Seduction and the illusion of choice. One of the most subtle aspects of seductive fields is that choice appears to remain intact. You can scroll away, you can ignore the ad, you can unfollow, and yet the field continues to operate. Because seduction does not depend on compulsion, it depends on frequency. Repeated exposure normalizes the offered state. Over time, the nervous system begins to prefer it. Alternative states feel uncomfortable, dull, or effortful. This is not coercion, it is habituation, and habituation is one of the most powerful forces in biology. When comfort replaces discernment, the danger of seductive fields is not that they deceive, it is that they remove the need to discern. When something feels good consistently, questioning it feels unnecessary, even disruptive. This is how exploitative work cultures maintain loyalty, misaligned brands build devotion, ideological movements stabilize themselves, and parasocial relationships deepen, not through pressure, through comfort, and comfort, when unexamined, becomes authority. Buyer's remorse, revisited buyer's remorse, is often framed as regret, but biologically, it is something else. It is cognition returning after somatic action. The sequence is consistent. 1. The state is regulated externally. 2. Action is taken. 3. Dopamine resolves. 4. Reflection re-engages. The remorse is not about the object. It is about the delay. This same sequence appears in relationships entered quickly, commitments made under warmth, and identities adopted during vulnerability. Seduction does not eliminate thinking. It postpones it. The cultural normalization of seduction, perhaps the most concerning aspect of modern seduction, is how normal it has become. We expect marketing to feel personal, brands to understand us, platforms to anticipate desire, and content to regulate mood. We are surprised when this doesn't happen. The field has trained us to expect sedation. In such an environment, discernment can feel harsh, isolating, or ungrateful. This is not accidental. A sedated nervous system is easier to orient. The cost of constant softness seduction does not exhaust the nervous system immediately. It soothes it. But long-term, constant softness without oscillation leads to dullness, loss of curiosity, decreased self-trust, and dependency on external regulation. The nervous system forgets how to return to itself. This is not a collapse. It is drift, and drift is difficult to notice because it feels pleasant. Recognizing seductive fields without rejecting comfort. This section is not an argument against comfort. Comfort is essential, but comfort without return, without reflection, without checking, becomes directional. The aim is not to harden against seduction. It is to reintroduce oscillation. Comfort to reflection, and reflection to choice, not comfort to continuation. As this section draws to a close, there is nothing to resist, only something to recognize. When comfort appears suddenly and convincingly, ask, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, what is this inviting me away from? Not, what is this trying to sell me? Seduction is rarely about the object. It is about direction, and direction matters. In the next section, we will anchor this understanding historically, tracing how engineered desire became systemic, and how language learned to bypass reflection by aligning directly with the nervous system. For now, let this settle. Comfort can be real. Warmth can be sincere, but neither replaces the quiet act of returning to yourself. Historical anchor, engineered desire, and the long arc of seduction. Seduction did not arrive with social media. It did not begin with advertising, branding, influencers, or digital platforms. Those are merely the latest surfaces upon which a much older process expresses itself. Seduction has always accompanied power. Wherever large populations needed to be oriented without force, seduction emerged as the preferred method. It is quieter than coercion, more stable than fear, less volatile than violence, and far more enduring. Force creates resistance. Seduction creates participation. This distinction marks the true historical turning point in mass influence. Long before language was formalized into ideology, humans learned something fundamental about social organization. People move more willingly when they believe they are choosing their direction. Seduction is the technology that makes that belief feel true. In early societies, seduction took the form of ritual, myth, and symbol. Authority was not asserted through constant domination, but through atmosphere. Sacred spaces softened vigilance. Rhythms entrained bodies. Shared stories dissolved individual orientation into collective meaning. People did not need to be convinced. They needed to belong. And belonging has always been regulating to the nervous system. The body settles when it senses inclusion. Breath slows. Threat diminishes. Individual checking gives way to collective alignment. This is not manipulation in the modern sense. It is biological synchronization. As societies grew larger and more complex, the same principles scaled. Kings ruled not only through armies, but through ceremony. Religious institutions maintained influence not solely through doctrine, but through architecture, music, incense, and ritual pacing. These were not aesthetic choices. They were somatic technologies. Cathedrals softened posture. Chanting regulated breath. Repetition entrained memory. Symbolism anchored identity. The nervous system learned safety inside the structure. Seduction did not demand belief. It felt coherent. Once coherence was established, belief followed naturally. The modern era did not invent seduction. It industrialized it. The early 20th century marked a decisive shift. Influence moved from moral authority to psychological engineering. This was not driven by conspiracy, but by discovery. For the first time, mass communication intersected with emerging insights into human psychology, unconscious motivation, and emotional conditioning. Those who studied these intersections realized something unsettling. People rarely act on reason alone. They act on feeling first and justify later. This insight transformed everything. Communication is no longer needed to persuade the mind. It needed to regulate the body. Desire, once considered personal, became a manageable variable. At this point in history, seduction ceased to be incidental and became strategic. Language shifted, imagery shifted. The cadence of public messaging softened. Appeals to rational self-interest gave way to appeals to identity, aspiration, and belonging. Products were no longer sold as objects. They were sold as extensions of the self. Consumption became symbolic. This shift was not subtle. Advertising stopped asking, "What does this do?" and began asking, "Who will you be when you have this?" The nervous system responded accordingly. Identity coherence feels regulating. Aspiration feels hopeful. Belonging feels safe. Seduction became systemic because it worked. One of the most important historical insights here is that seduction thrives in times of uncertainty. Periods of rapid social change, economic instability, or cultural fragmentation increase nervous system load. People seek anchors. They seek meaning that feels stable. They seek relief from complexity. Seduction offers simplification without confrontation. It does not resolve uncertainty. It covers it with atmosphere. This is why seduction often intensifies during economic crises, technological shifts, cultural upheaval, and identity destabilization. The more uncertain the environment, the more appealing the promise of coherence becomes. As mass media expanded, seduction became ambient. Radio, film, and television each increased the intimacy of influence. Voices entered living rooms. Faces became familiar. Narratives repeated until they felt personal. The nervous system does not distinguish between direct and mediated presence. Familiarity produces safety signals regardless of source. This biological reality is foundational to MLH field theory. Repeated linguistic and symbolic exposure updates neural prediction models. The body learns what to expect, and expectation shapes trust. Trust does not require truth, it requires predictability. Seduction provides predictability through consistency of tone, imagery, and narrative. Once consistency is established, vigilance fades. What changed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries was not the nature of seduction, but its granularity. Digital technologies allowed influence to become personalized. Algorithms adjusted frequency, timing, and tone in response to behavior. Seduction became adaptive. The field no longer broadcast a single message. It mirrored each individual back to themselves. This is a profound shift. Seduction stopped being general and became intimate. But intimacy does not require reciprocity to be effective. It requires attunement, and attunement can be simulated. Throughout history, seduction has always relied on one core principle. The body accepts before the mind evaluates. This principle was once intuitive. It is now engineered. Language learned to soften rather than excite. Imagery learned to invite rather than demand. Narratives learned to affirm rather than challenge. The nervous system, once soothed, does not ask many questions. This is not a failure of intellect. It is a feature of mammalian biology. One of the most persistent myths of modernity is that education inoculates against seduction. It does not. Seduction does not target ignorance. It targets exhaustion. Highly intelligent individuals are often more susceptible to seduction because they spend more time managing complexity. When relief appears, the temptation to rest inside it is strong. Seduction does not need you to be naive. It needs you to be tired. Another myth is that seduction requires deception. It does not. Seduction often uses truths, partial truths, emotional truths, aspirational truths, arranged in a way that displaces internal reference. Truth can be seductive when it arrives without context. Comforting truths are particularly effective. They quiet the nervous system while leaving deeper contradictions untouched. Historically, seduction has always been paired with a later phase. Softening precedes restructuring. Once vigilance drops, new norms can be introduced gently. Expectations shift, boundaries blur, internal signals weaken. This is why seduction precedes gaslighting in the resonance matrix. You cannot erode someone's internal reference while they are tense. You must first make them comfortable enough to stop checking. Seduction has also always been framed as benevolence. Those who deploy it rarely see themselves as manipulators. They see themselves as helpers, guides, visionaries, facilitators of ease. This is not hypocrisy. It is alignment with the role seduction plays socially. Seduction stabilizes systems. It reduces friction. It keeps people engaged. In this sense, seduction is rewarded. Over time, cultures that rely heavily on seduction develop certain characteristics: avoidance of discomfort, intolerance for dissent, emphasis on positivity, suspicion of critique, and moralization of ease. Critical voices are not silenced overtly. They are simply reframed as disruptive, negative, or unnecessary. Seduction does not fight dissent. It outgrows it. Perhaps the most important historical lesson is this: seduction does not replace coercion. It makes coercion unnecessary. A seduced population polices itself, not through fear, but through alignment. None of this requires malicious intent. Seduction is a technology that emerges wherever influence seeks stability. It persists because it works, and because it feels good. As this section closes, it is important to hold a balanced view. Seduction is not inherently immoral. Comfort is not corruption. Warmth is not deception. The danger arises when seduction becomes unidirectional, when comfort is offered without return, when relief replaces reflection, when atmosphere substitutes for agency. History does not condemn seduction. It explains it, and the explanation restores choice. In the next section, we will return to the present and examine how NLP-style linguistic patterns emerged as a descriptive attempt to name these dynamics, and why the mirror linguistic hypothesis provides a biological framework that explains them without mysticism or myth. Neurolinguistic programming, NLP, marketing, and the mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLH, parallel seduction became controversial long before it became technical. The moment people began to notice that language could move others, not merely inform them, suspicion followed. Influence, once invisible, became something to be named, mapped, and occasionally feared. Neurolinguistic programming emerged within this tension, not as a unified science, not as a moral framework, but as an attempt to describe something already happening. NLP did not invent seduction. It arrived after seduction had already proven effective. What NLP attempted to do was notice patterns, linguistic, tonal, and postural, that seemed to reliably shift behavior. Its early practitioners observed that certain ways of speaking, pacing, framing, and sequencing produced predictable responses in others. This observation was not wrong. What was incomplete was the explanation. The mistake of treating language as command. One of the enduring myths surrounding NLP is that it treats language as a form of hidden command, as if words themselves possess coercive power that overrides free will. This framing is misleading. Language does not compel action. Language modulates state, and the state determines which actions feel available. NLP's early terminology, embedded commands, pacing and leading, presuppositions, attempted to name surface-level phenomena, but it lacked a biological substrate. Without that substrate, NLP oscillated between useful description and exaggerated promise. The mirror linguistic hypothesis fills this gap. MLH does not claim that language controls behavior. It claims that language mirrors and updates the nervous system's predictive models, which in turn shape perception, readiness, and response. In other words, language does not push, it tunes. Why NLP appeared when it did. NLP arose during a period when mass communication was expanding rapidly, psychology was moving beyond behaviorism, advertising was shifting from utility to identity, and therapy was exploring rapport and attunement. In this environment, it became increasingly obvious that how something was said mattered as much as what was said. Tone altered reception, pacing altered trust, mirroring altered comfort. These were not mystical insights, they were somatic observations. But without a clear model of the nervous system, NLP framed these observations as techniques rather than state phenomena. That distinction matters. Techniques imply control. State phenomena imply entrainment. The seductive error, instrumentalizing attunement. One of the core problems with NLP, as it was popularized, is that it instrumentalized something that is fundamentally relational. Attunement, matching pace, tone, and posture, is not manipulation in itself. It is how mammals establish safety. Infants rely on it. Animals depend on it. Humans use it constantly without awareness. The error occurred when attunement was treated as a lever rather than a mutual process. Once attunement is used one-directionally, to lead without reciprocity, it becomes seductive rather than connective. This distinction aligns perfectly with mirror linguistic field theory. MLHFT seduction is not about matching. It is about holding the match while moving the frame. Pacing, leading, and the illusion of guidance. One of NLP's most well-known concepts is pacing and leading. Pacing refers to matching the other person's state. Leading refers to introducing a shift once rapport is established. On the surface, this seems benign. But the critical question is, what happens to internal reference during this process? If pacing occurs without reciprocity, if only one nervous system is allowed to lead, then the interaction becomes asymmetric. The seduction lies not in pacing itself, but in what follows. The body relaxes during pacing. Trust increases. Critical vigilance drops. When the lead is introduced before cognition returns, the shift feels natural. This is not mind control. It is timing exploitation. Presuppositions and a quiet bypass. Another NLP observation involved presuppositions, statements that assume something is already true. For example, when you begin to feel comfortable here, as you notice how natural this feels. These phrases do not argue, they assume. But again, assumption alone does not compel belief. What presuppositions do is invite the body to check for confirmation. And if the body already feels warm, relaxed, or open, it finds evidence easily. The mind then follows. MLH explains this not as linguistic trickery, but as predictive coding. The nervous system continuously predicts internal states. When language aligns with sensation, prediction feels accurate. Accuracy feels like truth. Seduction exploits this loop. Sensory-rich language and the body's imagination. NLP also emphasize sensory-rich language, vivid descriptions that evoke sight, sound, touch, or movement. Again, this was not invented by NLP. Poetry has done this for millennia. Religion has done this through ritual. Advertising has refined it relentlessly. Why does it work? Because sensory language activates embodied simulation. The body begins to experience the described state before it exists. This simulation reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty reduction feels safe. Safety lowers vigilance, and lowered vigilance makes suggestions easier to accept. None of this requires deception. It requires resonance, where NLP went wrong. Neurolinguistic programming's core failure was not in noticing patterns, but in promising control. By presenting these observations as techniques that could be applied deliberately to influence others, NLP obscured the underlying truth. Influence emerges from state synchronization, not command execution. When practitioners attempted to use NLP mechanically, results were inconsistent. When influence did occur, it often relied on factors NLP did not account for: exhaustion, asymmetry of power, social context, and emotional vulnerability. Without a nervous system model, NLP became vulnerable to exaggeration and misuse. MLH reframes the entire discussion. Mirror linguistic hypothesis. Why language works biologically. The mirror linguistic hypothesis proposes that language functions as a biological feedback signal, not because words contain power, but because the nervous system mirrors patterns it encounters repeatedly. Tone mirrors tone, pacing mirrors pacing, effect mirrors effect. This mirroring updates internal predictive models: what is safe, what is normal, and what is expected. Once updated, behavior follows naturally. Seduction operates precisely here. It introduces linguistic and symbolic patterns that soften the autonomic system, reduce perceived threat, and increase coherence. The body accepts the update. Cognition comes later. Marketing has applied MLH without the language. Modern marketing does not need NLP language to apply these principles. It already does. Consider slow-paced voiceovers, reassuring color palettes, inclusive phrasing, people like you, identity-affirming narratives, and repetition without argument. These are not persuasive techniques. They are state engineering signals. The nervous system does not ask whether the product is necessary. It asks whether the environment feels regulating. If yes, action follows. This is seduction at scale. Why buyer's remorse is predictable. Buyer's remorse is not a failure of reason. It is the moment when cognition finally catches up with somatic action. The sequence is always the same. 1. The body entrains to comfort. 2. Action occurs. 3. Dopamine resolves. 4. Critical reflection re-engages. The remorse arises because cognition arrives to find a decision already made. NLP framed this as rapport followed by suggestion. MLH frames it as state-first decision-making. The latter is biologically inevitable in seduction. The ethical confusion around NLP. Much of the controversy around NLP stems from a misunderstanding. People fear that language can override autonomy. But autonomy is not overridden. It is temporarily suspended when internal reference shifts outward. This suspension does not require sinister intent. It requires timing and asymmetry. MLH clarifies that ethics do not hinge on techniques, but on reciprocity, awareness, and return. If attunement allows return to self, it is a connection. If attunement displaces return, it is seduction. Seduction is non-reciprocal attunement. This is the most important bridge between NLP and MLH. Seduction is attunement without return. The nervous system aligns with something external, but is not invited back to its own reference. Comfort becomes permanent. Reflection stays offline. Agency drifts. This is not hypnosis. It is entrainment. Why naming this matters. Many people sense seduction long after it has occurred. They say, I don't recognize myself anymore. I stopped questioning. I don't know when this became normal. Without language, these experiences become shame. MLH restores language without blame. It says, your nervous system did what nervous systems do. It was entrained to what felt safe. Seduction does not mean you were fooled. This bears repeating. Seduction does not mean deception succeeded. It means timing mattered more than truth. Truth delivered too late does not feel like truth. It feels like a disruption. That is why people often defend seductions they have already enacted: purchases, identities, and loyalties. Cognition recruits justification to preserve coherence. This is not dishonesty. It is self-protection. The end of technique thinking. One of the most important outcomes of integrating NLP observations with MLH is the end of technique thinking. No script guarantees influence. No phrase compels behavior. There is only state alignment, and state alignment is always relational, contextual, and reversible if awareness returns in time. A quiet integration as this section closes. Nothing needs to be rejected. Not NLP, not marketing, not language. Only a single distinction needs to be held. Language that regulates before you have returned to yourself is not neutral. That does not make it evil. It makes it directional, and direction matters. In the next section, we will explore what happens after seduction, the delayed return of cognition, the experience of remorse, and how sovereignty can be restored without rejecting pleasure or comfort. Buyer's remorse. When cognition returns late, buyer's remorse is one of the most misunderstood human experiences. It is commonly framed as poor judgment, as impulsivity, as a weakness, as lack of discipline or foresight. But buyer's remorse is none of these things. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a flaw in character. It is not evidence that someone was fooled. Buyer's remorse is a temporal phenomenon. It is what happens when cognition returns after the body has already acted. And within the architecture of seduction, this delay is not incidental, it is structural. The false story we tell about regret. Most cultural narratives about regret follow the same arc. You should have known better. You rushed. You didn't think it through. These stories assume a sequence that rarely reflects reality. They assume thought, which leads to decision, decision leads to action, and as a result, experienced consequence. But seduction operates in a different order entirely. State leads to action, and meaning leads to evaluation. The remorse appears not because the decision was irrational, but because evaluation arrived too late to participate. This distinction matters deeply, because without it, people internalize blame for something that unfolded before conscious choice was fully available. The body acts first throughout this series. We've returned to a core biological truth. The nervous system responds before reflective cognition engages. This is not pathology, it is survival architecture. The body's job is to orient towards safety, coherence, and regulation. When an environment provides these signals, warmth, reassurance, familiarity, and belonging, the nervous system relaxes. Relaxation is interpreted as resolution. Once resolution is felt, action becomes easy. Purchasing, agreeing, committing, and aligning. These actions do not feel forced. They feel natural, which is why they are later defended so strongly. The dopamine curve of seduction follows a predictable neurochemical arc. Anticipation builds gently. Comfort increases. Action is taken. Dopamine resolves. This resolution feels like completion. But dopamine does not sustain coherence. It simply marks the end of a motivational cycle. Once it drops, the nervous system begins to reorient, and this is when cognition returns, not as judgment, but as an assessment. The mind begins asking questions that were unnecessary moments earlier. Does this actually fit? Was this what I wanted? Why do I feel uneasy now? The unease is not about the action. It is about sequence. Why remorse feels personal. Buyer's remorse feels deeply personal because it emerges internally. There is no obvious external cause to point to, no threat, no pressure, no visible manipulation. So the individual turns inward. I did this to myself. I ignored my instincts. I wasn't paying attention. But what was ignored was not instinct. It was timing. Instinct acted. Reflection arrived later. This is not a betrayal of self. It is biology operating as designed inside a seductive field. Regret as a signal, not a verdict. One of the most damaging interpretations of regret is that it is a verdict on character. In reality, regret is a signal. It signals that internal reference has returned, that cognition has come back online, that the system is ready to reassess alignment. Regret is not failure, it is re-entry. But when regret is shamed or dismissed, the individual loses the opportunity to learn from sequence. Instead of asking, what happened in my nervous system? They ask, what's wrong with me? This shift keeps the cycle intact. The justification trap. When regret appears after action, many people move quickly to justification. This is not dishonesty. It is nervous system protection. The mind attempts to preserve coherence by rationalizing what the body has already done. I needed it. It's not that bad. It makes sense given everything. These justifications are often partially true, but they also prevent integration. Integration requires allowing the discomfort of delayed awareness without rushing to erase it. Seduction relies on the fact that most people would rather justify than sit with dissonance. Remorse in relationships, not just purchases. The term buyer's remorse understates the phenomenon. The same sequence occurs in relationships entered too quickly, commitments made under warmth, identities adopted during vulnerability, and ideologies embraced during uncertainty. The remorse may not arrive as regret. It may arrive as confusion, dullness, loss of enthusiasm, vague discomfort, and a sense of being off. These are somatic signals that cognition has returned and found misalignment. But because the decision is already embedded, socially, emotionally, and publicly, people often suppress these signals. They mistake discomfort for disloyalty. Why seduction discourages reflection. Seduction is stabilized by continuation. Once action has occurred, the field often encourages forward motion, more purchases, deeper commitment, increased identification, and public affirmation. This continuation delays reflection further. The longer reflection is postponed, the harder it becomes to integrate without disruption. This is why remorse often appears suddenly, sometimes months or years later, when continuation can no longer hold coherence together. The nervous system wants closure. One of the most important insights here is that the nervous system prefers closure over accuracy. Seduction offers closure quickly. Reflection reopens uncertainty. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive, so the system resists reflection even when misalignment is present. This is not weakness, it is efficiency. But efficiency without alignment leads to drift. The shame loop. When remorse is framed as stupidity or failure, shame enters. Shame does not restore agency, it collapses it. Shame tells the nervous system, you cannot trust yourself. This is catastrophic, because self-trust is not built through perfection, but through accurate sequencing. Understanding remorse as delayed awareness restores trust. My system acted, and now I can reassess. This is how learning occurs. Reframing buyer's remorse. A healthier frame is this. Buyer's remorse is the moment when agency returns. It is not the moment something went wrong. It is the moment awareness came back online. Seen this way, remorse becomes valuable. It marks the end of sedation, the return of discernment. The role of time. Time is the missing variable in most discussions of seduction. Not clock time, but neural time. The gap between state change and reflection determines the outcome. Seduction shortens this gap artificially. Recovery from seduction lengthens it gently. This is not done through discipline. It is done through allowing cognition to arrive before the next action. Learning without punishment. One of the most important things to understand is that remorse does not require punishment. No self-attack, no withdrawal, no rejection of pleasure. Punishment teaches nothing. Recognition does. Recognition restores sequencing. The moment of choice after remorse offers a quiet opportunity, not to undo the past, but to decide how the future will be paced. The question becomes, can I allow myself to pause next time comfort appears? not how do I stop wanting comfort. This is a crucial distinction. Seduction does not need to be rejected. It needs to be timed. Returning without renouncing. One of the great fears around recognizing seduction is that it requires renunciation. That pleasure must be sacrificed. That ease must be abandoned. That warmth must be distrusted. This is false. What must be restored is the return. Comfort leading to reflection, and reflection to permit choice, not comfort to continuation. When return is restored, pleasure becomes integrated rather than directive. The quiet restoration of sovereignty. Sovereignty does not arrive as control. It arrives as patience. The patience to let cognition arrive before acting again. The patience to sit with dissonance without erasing it. The patience to trust that discomfort is not danger. This patience is biological. It emerges when the nervous system learns that it will not be punished for pausing. If remorse has been part of your life, in purchases, relationships, beliefs, or identities, nothing here asks you to judge yourself. Instead, consider this reframe. You did not fail to think. You acted before thinking was needed, and now thinking has returned. That is not an error. That is the sequence. In the next and final sections of this episode, we will explore how to remain open to comfort without surrendering agency, and how seduction transitions into the final phase of this arc, gaslighting, where internal reference is no longer trusted at all. Observation practice. The comfort test. There is a particular moment that marks the beginning of seduction. It is not the moment you want something. It is not the moment you agree. It is not even the moment you act. It is the moment when checking stops. This section is not about preventing that moment. It is about noticing it without resistance, noticing it without moral framing, noticing it without trying to change the outcome. Seduction does not end when you say no. It ends when awareness returns before continuation. Why this is an observation, not a practice. The word practice often implies discipline, repetition, or improvement. That is not what is being offered here. Nothing is to be trained. Nothing is to be mastered. Nothing is to be corrected. This is an observational orientation, a way of noticing sequence without intervening in it. Seduction relies on unconscious timing. Observation restores conscious timing. The moment comfort arrives across cultures, contexts, and experiences, seduction announces itself through the same signal: relief. Relief from effort, relief from uncertainty, and relief from vigilance. This relief may feel subtle or profound. It may appear as a quiet internal yes, a sense of settling, a softening of concern, and a thought that says, this feels right. What matters is not the content of the relief, but what follows it. Seduction begins when relief becomes authoritative, when the nervous system treats comfort as sufficient evidence. The comfort test, the observation offered here, is simple. Notice what happens immediately after comfort appears, not later, not after action, not during regret, but in this moment. Does checking stop? Does questioning feel unnecessary? Does continuation feel easier than pause? These are not mistakes, they are signals. Where attention goes when comfort arrives, attention shifts. It often moves, away from the body, away from subtle discomfort, away from uncertainty, and toward the offered narrative. This shift is not forced, it feels like ease, but ease has direction. Observation begins by noticing where attention relocates itself when comfort enters. Does it move outward? Does it narrow? Does it become absorbed? This noticing is neutral. It does not interrupt the process. It illuminates it. The softening of internal dialogue. Another reliable marker of seduction is the quieting of internal dialogue. Questions fade, counterpoints dissolve, caution relaxes. The mind does not argue. It rests. This rest feels deserved. Observation here does not require reactivating the dialogue. It simply notices that it stopped, not why, not whether it should, just that it did. The drop in effort is metabolically expensive. Seduction promises efficiency. When comfort arrives, effort drops. Effort to evaluate, effort to compare, and effort to hold complexity. This drop is not laziness. It is biological optimization. The nervous system chooses the path of least resistance when the threat appears to have passed. Observation means noticing what no longer feels effortful, and whether that ease arrived before alignment was confirmed. The felt sense of enough seduction often carries a sense of completeness, not excitement, not anticipation. Completion. This is enough. I don't need more information. I can stay here. Completion feels like closure, but closure can be premature. Observation does not challenge closure. It notes its timing. When skepticism feels disruptive, one of the clearest signs of seduction is when skepticism feels inappropriate. When questioning feels rude, unnecessary, ungrateful, and out of place. This does not mean skepticism is wrong. It means the state has shifted. Observation involves noticing when doubt feels like disruption rather than discernment. The absence of urgency provocation created urgency. Seduction removes it. This absence feels peaceful, but urgency is not the only signal worth tracking. The absence of urgency can be just as informative. Observation notices when urgency disappears, what disappears with it, and what decisions become easier. Ease without urgency can still be directional. The moment of continuation. Seduction stabilizes itself through continuation. Scrolling continues. Engagement continues. Purchasing continues. Agreement continues. Not because of pressure, because stopping would require reintroducing effort. Observation notices the pull toward continuation. not to stop it, just to see it. The body's quiet agreement, perhaps the most important aspect of this observation, is somatic. When comfort arrives, the body often signals agreement. Softened jaw, relaxed shoulders, open chest, and slower breath. These are not signals of consent. They are signals of regulation. Observation notices regulation without interpreting it as alignment. No analysis, no correction. This observation does not ask, is this manipulative? Should I stop? What does this mean? Those questions come later, if at all. Right now, the only thing that matters is timing. When did comfort arrive? When did checking stop? When did continuation feel easier than pause? That is the entire observation. Why this works without effort. Seduction depends on unconsciousness. Observation introduces consciousness without friction. Once you notice the moment comfort becomes authoritative, seduction loses some of its invisibility, not its power, its automaticity. This is enough. You do not need to act differently. You do not need to decide differently. You only need to see when things happen. Sequence awareness restores choice. When observation feels uncomfortable sometimes, noticing breaks the spell. Comfort feels thinner, ease feels less convincing. A quiet discomfort emerges. This discomfort is not danger. It is a return of cognition, return of internal reference, return of self-checking. Do not rush to erase this discomfort. It is not a problem. It is the nervous system recalibrating. When observation does nothing sometimes, observation changes nothing. Comfort continues. Continuation proceeds. Action occurs. This is not failure. Seduction does not require interruption to be understood. Understanding arrives over time. The absence of moral weight. This observation carries no moral weight. There is no good noticing or bad noticing. There is only noticing. Seduction thrives on judgment, either indulgence or self-attack. Observation sidesteps both. A quiet shift over time, something subtle may occur. The moment of comfort becomes recognizable, not resisted, not rejected. Recognized, and recognition introduces a pause. Even a small pause changes everything. A final orientation for this section. This observation is not about becoming vigilant. It is about becoming temporally literate, knowing when comfort arrived, knowing when to check, knowing when action follows. This literacy does not remove pleasure, it restores choice. As this section closes, hold only this: seduction does not require resistance. It requires awareness of timing, and timing returns agency without effort. Self-reflection prompt. There is only one question in this section. No exercise, no journaling, no instruction to work on anything. Just a single point of contact. Seduction does not require blindness. It requires timing. This question is not meant to produce an answer immediately. In fact, if it does, that answer is likely cognitive, rehearsed, or protective. The value of the question lies not in resolution, but in how the body responds when it is held. The prompt is this: when comfort appears, what part of me wants to stop checking? That's it. Not why comfort feels good, not whether it was justified, not who offered it. Just what part of you feels relieved enough to disengage from observation. For some, this part is tired. For some, it is hopeful. For some, it is lonely. For some, it is simply done holding tension. None of these are flaws. Seduction does not target weakness. It targets needs that have been carrying weight for a long time. This question is not asking you to remove comfort from your life. It is asking you to notice the moment when comfort becomes a signal to disengage from internal reference. You may notice nothing at first. You may notice an image, a sensation, a memory, a quiet internal. You may also notice resistance to the question itself. That resistance is information. Do not push past it. Let the question rest where it lands. Sometimes it will surface during a purchase, sometimes in a relationship, sometimes in a belief, sometimes in a moment of relief after pressure. There is no correct timing. This is not a test. The nervous system reveals what it is ready to reveal, and only when safety is present. If nothing emerges, nothing is wrong. The question will remain available. Seduction dissolves not through exposure, but through recognition of the moment. We hand over responsibility for checking. This question simply illuminates that handover point. No answer is required, just the willingness to let the question exist. Integration comfort is not consent. Seduction does not end with exposure. It does not dissolve because it has been named. It does not loosen because its mechanisms have been understood. Seduction ends quietly when internal reference returns before continuation, and when comfort is allowed without surrendering orientation. This final section is not a summary. It is an integration, a settling of the nervous system after insight, a return to ground after warmth, a reminder that awareness does not require vigilance. Throughout this episode, seduction has been approached not as desire, temptation, or moral weakness, but as state change, a shift in tone, a softening of guard, a moment where effort drops and checking feels unnecessary. Nothing about that shift is wrong. In fact, it is deeply human. The nervous system seeks regulation. It seeks coherence. It seeks relief. Seduction offers all three. The issue is not comfort. The issue is what comfort replaces. When comfort replaces reflection, agency drifts. When warmth substitutes for discernment, alignment thins. When ease becomes authoritative, choice quietly steps aside. This is not because the individual failed. It is because the sequence was interrupted. One of the most corrosive myths surrounding seduction is that it requires rejection. That once seen, it must be resisted. That awareness demands renunciation. that sovereignty means saying no to pleasure, ease, or reassurance. This myth creates unnecessary conflict. Seduction does not need to be expelled from life. It needs to be resequenced. Comfort to reflection and reflection to choice. Not comfort, continuation to justification. This is the only integration required. Many people, upon recognizing seduction, attempt to swing to the opposite extreme. They harden. They distrust warmth. They reject ease. They become hyper-analytical. This is not sovereignty. It is another form of dysregulation. Seduction softened the nervous system too quickly. Hypervigilance hardens it too rigidly. Neither restores balance. Integration lives in the middle. A regulated nervous system can tolerate comfort and uncertainty. It can receive warmth without surrendering reference. It can enjoy ease without abandoning inquiry. It can rest without disappearing. This is not a cognitive skill. It is a biological capacity, and like all capacities, it returns through experience, not effort. As this episode closes, it is important to acknowledge something subtle but profound. Seduction is often the least violent form of influence. It does not shock. It does not threaten. It does not overtly coerce, which is why it is so effective and why it often goes unchallenged. But seduction alone does not break agency. What breaks agency is what follows when seduction is uninterrupted. Seduction softens. What comes next determines outcome. If reflection returns, seduction becomes experience. If reflection stays offline, seduction becomes trajectory. This is the hinge point, and this hinge is not located in willpower. It is located in timing. Over the course of this episode, you may have recognized seduction in many places. In advertising, in digital intimacy, in branding, in ideology, in relationships, in moments of relief after pressure. Recognition does not demand response. It does not require confrontation. It simply restores orientation, and orientation is enough. One of the quiet dangers of seduction is that it makes dissent feel unnecessary. Not wrong, just irrelevant. When comfort is present, questioning feels like effort without reward. This is how seduction stabilizes itself. But awareness reintroduces something gentle and destabilizing. Choice. Choice does not shout. It does not argue. It waits, and when choice returns, seduction no longer decides direction alone. As this episode comes to a close, there is no instruction to be careful. There is no warning to watch out. Fear collapses awareness. Instead, there is only this orientation. When comfort arrives, allow reflection to arrive as well. Not immediately, not forcefully, and just eventually. Let cognition come back online before the next commitment. This restores agency without effort. Seduction does not mean you were naive. It means your nervous system accepted regulation. That acceptance was not wrong. What matters now is whether regulation is paired with return. This is where the arc of phase 2 turns. Provocation created charge and heat. Seduction created ease. The next movement is quieter and yet more destabilizing. When seduction softens internal reference, gaslighting removes it, not by force, not by threat, but by teaching you to doubt the signal that just returned. Gaslighting does not begin with lies. It begins when your restored awareness is gently questioned, when your doubt is reframed as confusion, when your perception is treated as unreliable, when comfort is offered as correction. Seduction prepares the ground. Gaslighting restructures it. So as we close this episode, there is no call to action, only a closing orientation. Comfort is not consent. Warmth is not truth. Ease is not alignment. But neither are they enemies. They are states, and states do not decide for you unless you let them. In the next episode, we move into the final phase of this arc, where comfort has softened vigilance, where reflection has begun to return, and where influence shifts from invitation to invalidation. Episode 7, Gaslighting, when your internal signal is no longer trusted. Gaslighting does not attack you directly. It teaches you to question the very awareness that just came back online. We'll explore how this happens linguistically, somatically, and relationally, and how sovereignty is quietly eroded, not through domination, but through doubt. Until next time, stay with the moment after comfort settles. That brief interval when the body relaxes, the narrative holds, and awareness begins to stir again. That moment is not disruption. It is return, and return is where choice quietly waits. And thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to The Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 6, Seduction. I'm James Miller.